1 pound of meat. That's roughly 450 grams. If you put it on a plate right now, you'd look at it and think that's barely enough for 2 people. Your nan looked at that same piece of meat and fed a family of 6 for an entire week. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, 7 days, and nobody went hungry. She didn't have a cookbook for this, she didn't watch a tutorial. She had a set of tricks passed down from her mother, who learned them from her mother, all the way back to a time when wasting a single scrap of food wasn't just careless, it was dangerous. These are 25 genius British nan recipes that turned 1 pound of meat into a week's worth of meals. And honestly, half of them are smarter than anything you'll find in a modern kitchen. Number 25. The Sunday roast itself. Before we get into what happened to the leftovers, we need to talk about how your nan cooked that original piece of meat, because she wasn't just making dinner, she was planning the entire week. A 1 pound joint of beef, pork or lamb went into a roasting tin with dripping surrounded by potatoes and whatever root vegetables were cheap that week. The joint was cooked low and slow to get every last bit of flavour out of it, and it was carved so thin you could practically read a newspaper through it. Everyone at the table got 2 thin slices, maybe 3 if it was a special occasion. The rest was wrapped in greaseproof paper and put straight in the cold larder. That meat had a job to do for the next 6 days, and Sunday was just the opening act. Number 24. Monday's cold meat and bubble. The day after the roast was always cold cuts. 2 thin slices of whatever was left from yesterday, served with bubble and squeak made from Sunday's leftover vegetables. Mash up the potatoes, cabbage, sprouts and carrots. Fry the whole lot in the roasting tin, dripping until the bottom goes properly crispy. Lay the cold meat alongside it, maybe with a splash of brown sauce, and that's Monday sorted. No reheating, no fuss. The meat stayed cold because ovens cost money to run and nobody was firing one up for a Monday night tea. This was a meal that took about 10 minutes to put together and used nothing that wasn't already sitting in the kitchen from yesterday. Number 23. Dripping toast for Tuesday breakfast. That roasting tin from Sunday still had a thick layer of fat and meat juices in the bottom. Your nan scraped every bit of it into a bowl, let it set in the cold larder, and that became the week's supply of dripping. Spread on toast with salt, this was breakfast for the entire family on a Tuesday morning. The brown jelly layer underneath the white fat was pure concentrated meat flavour. Kids would scrape it out with a spoon if their mum wasn't watching. 1 roasting tin's worth of dripping could last 3 or 4 days of breakfasts. Free protein, free fat, free flavour. All from a joint that was already doing double duty as cold cuts. Number 22. Shepherd's pie. By Tuesday evening, there wasn't enough meat left on that joint to carve proper slices anymore, so your nan got the mincer out. Whatever scraps were left, even the slightly dry bits from near the bone, went through the hand mincer. Mixed with a diced onion, a few carrots and a splash of gravy made from Bisto, the whole lot went into a pie dish. Topped with mashed potato and baked until the peaks went golden brown. The trick was the ratio. Maybe 150 grams of actual meat stretched with onions and carrots until the dish looked full. The mashed potato on top was doing most of the heavy lifting, and nobody minded because it came out of the oven bubbling and golden and smelling like Sunday all over again. Number 21. Bone broth. Once the meat was stripped off that joint, the bone went straight into the stock pot. Covered with water, with an onion, a carrot and a bay leaf thrown in, that bone simmered on the back of the stove for hours. By the time your nan was done with it, she had a pot of rich golden stock that would form the base of at least 3 more meals that week. Soup, gravy, stew. Every single one started with that bone broth. The bone itself got reboiled the next day for a weaker second stock, and even after that, some nans would crack the bones open and spread the marrow on toast. Nothing was finished until it had absolutely nothing left to give. Number 20. Soup from the bones. Wednesday's lunch was almost always soup, and it cost virtually nothing because the broth was already made. Pour the bone stock into a pot. Add a diced potato, a chopped leek if you had one, or an onion if you didn't. Maybe a handful of pearl barley or lentils to thicken it up. Simmer until everything's soft. Season with salt and pepper. Done. If there were any tiny shreds of meat still clinging to the bone after making the stock, those went into the soup as well. You might get a teaspoon's worth, but in a household where nothing was wasted, a teaspoon of meat in a bowl of soup was still a teaspoon of meat. Served with bread and butter, this was a hot, filling lunch that cost pennies and used ingredients that were essentially byproducts of Sunday's dinner. Number 19. Rissoles. This was your nan's way of turning almost nothing into something that looked like a proper meal. Take a tiny amount of leftover mince from the shepherd's pie, or whatever scraps you could find. Mix it with mashed potato, a bit of onion, and some seasoning. Shape it into patties, coat them in breadcrumbs, and fry them in dripping. The ratio of meat to potato in a rissole was probably 1 to 4, maybe 1 to 5. But because they were coated in crispy breadcrumbs and fried until golden, they looked and felt like something substantial. Served with chips and peas, a plate of rissoles looked like a real dinner. The fact that each patty contained about a tablespoon of actual meat was your nan's secret, and she wasn't telling anyone. Number 18. Stuffed cabbage leaves. Take a few outer leaves from a cabbage. Blanch them in boiling water until they're pliable. Mix a tiny amount of leftover mince with cooked rice, a diced onion, and some herbs. Roll the mixture up inside the cabbage leaves, pack them into a dish, pour over some of that bone stock, and bake until everything's tender. Each roll contained maybe a tablespoon of meat. The rice and onion did the rest, but because the whole thing was bathed in rich meaty stock, every bite tasted like it had more meat in it than it actually did. This was a trick your nan learned from her nan, who probably learned it during the war, when meat was rationed and you had to make 2 ounces stretch across an entire meal. The cabbage was doing 90% of the work. The meat was just there for flavor and morale. Number 17. Meat pudding. Suet pastry rolled out thin, lined into a pudding basin, filled with a tiny amount of diced meat mixed with onion and a thick gravy, then sealed with a pastry lid and steamed for hours. The genius here is the pastry. Suet crust is heavy and filling. It absorbs all that gravy while it steams, so by the time you cut into it, the pastry itself tastes meaty. You could get away with putting 2 or 3 small cubes of actual meat inside and the whole thing still delivered. Steamed for 2 to 3 hours, wrapped in a cloth or foil, sitting in a pot of simmering water on the stove. Your nan would put it on mid-morning and forget about it until tea time. The house smelled incredible all afternoon, which was half the point. Number 16. Savoury mince on toast. This was the ultimate there's barely anything left, but we're still eating meal. A tiny amount of minced meat, maybe 50 grams at most, fried with an onion and stretched with a pint of gravy. Sometimes a few peas went in, sometimes a diced carrot. Pour it over thick slices of toast, and you've got a meal that looks generous and tastes like it has more meat than it does. The gravy does all the work. The toast soaks it up. The mince is almost a garnish at this point, but your brain registers meat and feels satisfied. This was a Thursday night regular in houses across Britain. Not because anyone loved it particularly, but because it used almost nothing and filled the gap until Friday's fish. Number 15. Meat and potato pie. Different from shepherd's pie because this one has pastry, and pastry changes everything. Line a pie dish with short crust. Fill it with diced potatoes, a small amount of diced meat, diced onion, and enough gravy to keep it moist. Top with another sheet of pastry. Brush with a bit of milk. Bake until golden. The filling is 90% potato and onion. But because it's sealed inside pastry and swimming in meaty gravy, every forkful tastes like a proper meat pie. Your nan knew that people eat with their eyes first, and a golden pastry crust makes anything look like a feast. Some nans would make individual pies, so everyone felt like they were getting their own. Portion control disguised as generosity. Number 14. Faggots, the absolute peak of use everything cooking. Heart, liver, and any offal your nan could get cheap from the butcher, minced with breadcrumbs, onion, sage, and a bit of the original meat dripping, rolled into balls, packed into a tin, and baked in thick onion gravy. This wasn't leftovers from the Sunday joint. This was your nan going to the butcher midweek and buying the bits nobody else wanted for a few pennies. Offal was practically given away because nobody with money would touch it. A tray of faggots cost almost nothing to make and fed the whole family. Served with mash and mushy peas, they were filling, rich, and genuinely delicious. The sage and onion did the heavy lifting. The offal just provided the protein. Number 13, stew and dumplings. If your nan still had a bit of meat left by Wednesday, this is where it went. Cubed small and browned in dripping, then slow cooked with onions, carrots, turnip, and potatoes in that bone stock she'd been building all week. The dumplings were the real trick. Flour, suet, salt, water. Dropped into the stew for the last 20 minutes, they'd puff up and absorb all that meaty liquid until they were twice their original size. 3 dumplings and a ladle full of stew, and you'd barely notice there were only 4 or 5 cubes of actual meat in your bowl. Your nan's dumplings weren't light and fluffy like the ones in cookbooks. They were dense, heavy, and sat in your stomach like a brick. That was the point. You couldn't be hungry after eating 2 of those things. Physically impossible. Number 12. Corned beef hash. When the Sunday joint was completely exhausted by midweek, a tin of corned beef stepped in, and at a few pence per tin, it was one of the cheapest proteins in the shop. Dice it up with potatoes and onions, fry the whole lot together in dripping until the potatoes are crispy and the corned beef starts to break apart. Serve it with a fried egg on top if you had eggs, or just with brown sauce if you didn't. 1 tin of corned beef made enough hash for 4 people. Your nan could stretch it to 6 by adding more potatoes. The corned beef was salty and fatty enough that even a small amount flavored the entire pan. Number 11. Liver and onions. Lamb's liver was almost as cheap as offal, and your nan bought it specifically because it was the one cut of meat where a small amount went a long way. Slice it thin, dredge it in seasoned flour, and fry it fast in a hot pan with onions. The onions were the star, cooked low and slow until they were sweet and caramelized, then piled on top of the liver with thick gravy poured over everything. The plate looked generous because of all those onions, but the actual liver portion was maybe 2 or 3 thin slices per person. Served with mash, this was a Wednesday or Thursday staple. Kids either loved it or absolutely hated it. There was no middle ground with liver and onions. Number 10. Potted meat. The very last scraps of the Sunday joint, the bits too small to slice or mince, got turned into potted meat. Boil them until they're falling apart. Mash them with butter, salt, pepper, and a pinch of mace. Press the paste into a ramekin and seal the top with a layer of melted butter. That sealed pot would sit in the cold larder for days. Spread on toast or bread, a single ramekin could provide 4 or 5 lunches. The butter seal kept the air out, so it lasted far longer than you'd expect. Your nan essentially invented a preservation method out of necessity. No fridge, no freezer, no cling film, just butter and patience. Number 9. Scotch broth. This is what happened when your nan wanted to make Sunday's leftover lamb stretch to its absolute limit. The lamb bone went into a pot with pearl barley, split peas, diced turnip, carrot, leek, and cabbage. The whole thing simmered for hours until the barley swelled up and the broth went thick and cloudy. Scotch broth is one of those soups that taste better the second day. Your nan knew this, which is why she'd make a massive pot and let it sit on the stove, reheating portions as needed. By day 2, the barley had absorbed so much liquid that the soup was practically solid. 1 lamb bone and a handful of cheap vegetables made enough broth to last 3 days. That's 9 meals from a bone that would have gone in the bin in any other kitchen. Number 8. Toad in the hole. When stretching the Sunday joint wasn't an option, your nan turned to sausages. The cheapest ones the butcher made, packed with more bread and rusk than actual pork, But it didn't matter, because they were going into Yorkshire pudding batter, 2 or 3 sausages arranged in a roasting tin, hot dripping poured in, batter poured over the top, into a screaming hot oven until the batter puffed up golden and crispy around the sausages. The Yorkshire pudding batter did all the work. It turned 3 sausages into a meal for 5 people. Served with onion gravy and whatever vegetables were around, this was a midweek dinner that felt like a proper occasion. The sausages were almost an afterthought once that batter had done its thing. Number 7. Peas pudding with ham stock. If your nan bought a ham hock or a bacon knuckle instead of a beef joint that week, the cooking liquid became the base for peas pudding. Dried split peas soaked overnight, then boiled in the ham stock until they completely broke down into a thick, smooth golden paste. The smoky, salty flavor from the ham bone permeated every molecule of that pudding. Spread on bread, served alongside cold ham slices, or eaten on its own with a spoon, peas pudding was practically free once you'd already bought the ham hock. The peas cost almost nothing, and the stock was just cooking water you would have thrown away. In the northeast, nans would make a batch that lasted the entire week. It sat in a bowl in the larder, getting thicker and more intense with each passing day. Number 6. Bread pudding. Not a meat recipe, but part of the system. Your nan's week wasn't just about stretching meat, it was about making sure nothing in the kitchen went to waste, and that included the bread. Every stale end, every dried out crust, every slice that went hard on the counter got saved in a bag. By the end of the week, she had enough stale bread to make a pudding. Soak it in water, squeeze it dry, mix with sugar, dried fruit, spice, an egg, and a splash of milk. Press into a tin and bake until dense and dark. This was Saturday's pudding. It cost almost nothing because every ingredient was either left over or bought for pennies. 1 tin fed the whole family and usually lasted into Sunday as well. Number 5. Scrag end stew. Scrag end was the cheapest cut at the butcher's, the bony, gristly neck end of the lamb that nobody with money wanted to touch. Your nan would buy it for a few pence because she knew something everyone else didn't. Slow cooked for 3 or 4 hours with root vegetables, pearl barley and water, scrag end transforms completely. The connective tissue breaks down into gelatin. The small pockets of meat fall off the bone. The broth goes thick and rich and glossy. You'd never serve scrag end as a joint, it looks terrible. But in a stew, buried under carrots and turnips and thickened with barley, it becomes something genuinely delicious. Your nan turned the worst cut in the shop into the best meal of the week. Number 4. Gravy stretching. This wasn't a recipe, it was a philosophy. And it's the single most important thing your nan did to make that pound of meat last all week. Sunday's roasting tin got deglazed with boiling water, every brown bit scraped up and dissolved, Bisto or flour added to thicken. That gravy served Sunday's roast, then the leftover gravy went into a jug in the larder. Monday, it went over the bubble and squeak. Tuesday, it stretched the shepherd's pie filling. Wednesday, it moistened the stew. Thursday, it made the savoury mince on toast taste like an actual meal instead of wet bread. Good gravy made bad food edible and average food delicious. It masked the fact that there was barely any meat left. It added richness to dishes that were mostly potato and onion. Your nan's gravy was the glue that held the entire week together. Number 3. Ham bone soup. If the week started with a ham hock instead of a beef joint, the bone got even more work than a beef bone did. After the meat was sliced off and the peas pudding was made, that bone still had flavour to give. Into a pot with lentils, a diced potato, an onion, a carrot, and water. Simmered until the lentils dissolved into the broth and the whole thing went thick and smoky. Any tiny shreds of ham still attached to the bone fell off during cooking and gave the soup little bursts of salt and meat. 1 ham bone made enough soup for 2 days of lunches. That's a bone that had already flavoured the peas pudding, already provided the stock for cooking the hock itself, and was still producing meals. 3 uses from 1 bone that cost nothing. Number 2. The Friday Fry-Up. Friday was traditionally fish day, but if fish was too expensive that week, your nan had a backup plan. Collect every leftover from the entire week. Cold potatoes from Wednesday's stew, a spoonful of mince from Tuesday, the last scraping of dripping from the bowl, a slice of bread going stale. Everything went into the frying pan together, fried until crispy, served with a fried egg on top and a cup of tea. It looked like a mess. It tasted like a summary of every good thing that had happened in that kitchen since Sunday. This wasn't a recipe anyone would write down. It was improvisation, different every single week depending on what was left, but the principle was always the same. If it's in the kitchen and it's edible, it goes in the pan on Friday. Number 1. The stock cube trick. This is the one that ties everything together, and it's so simple it barely counts as a recipe. But it's the most important thing on this list. Your nan saved everything. Potato peelings, onion skins, carrot tops, celery leaves, cabbage cores. Every vegetable trimming from every meal went into a pot of water on the back of the stove, simmered all day, strained, and mixed with whatever was left of the bone broth. The result was a deeply flavored stock that cost absolutely nothing and made every single meal taste better. Soup, stew, gravy, pie filling, mince, everything started with that stock. Modern kitchens have stock cubes. Your nan had a method. She built flavor from nothing, layered it throughout the week, and used it to turn a pound of meat into 21 meals for 6 people. That's not cooking, that's engineering. Here's the thing that gets lost when people talk about these recipes. Your nan didn't do this because she was creative or because she enjoyed the challenge. She did it because there was no other option. 1 pound of meat was the budget. Full stop. 6 mouths needed feeding, and there wasn't going to be a second trip to the butcher. Every trick on this list exists because a woman stood in her kitchen, looked at what she had, and figured out how to make it work. Not once, every single week. For years, we've got fridges now, and freezers, and supermarkets open 24 hours. We've got more food available than any generation in history, and somehow we waste 1/3 of it. Your nan would have had something to say about that, probably something sharp, followed by a cup of tea and a slice of bread pudding. If you want to see more kitchen wisdom that your nan never wrote down, that video is on screen now. Subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you in the next one.